And the situations in West Papua and Fiji in particular are certainly major areas for concern.
But there are always threats to media freedom in Pacific Island nations.
It's a bit of a lighthouse, you know, like that people can look at it and get information from.
Roles of the Pacific Media Centre was to give voice to those issues that just get swept under the rug, that get pushed aside, or don't get much airtime.
Pacific Media Watch really began in the University of Papua New Guinea and the University of Technology, Sydney. That's when it started off back in 1996. And then it's had different stages where it's been at the University of South Pacific and then coming here to Auckland University of Technology. First thing is really to defend journalists that are either arrested or harassed, assaulted. And we work quite closely with the media freedom organisations around the world. For example, Reporters Without Borders in Paris, and also Freedom House, Committee to Protect Journalists, but particularly RSF in Paris. The Tongan 3 case was actually how we really got started. At that time I was head of the journalism program at University of Papua New Guinea.
So the case of the 3 was just a shock to me, and it was a rallying point. And because David was then located in Sydney at UTS, where I was working, he was incredibly motivated and anxious to do what we could to make statements.
In September that year, 1996, Kalafi Moala, who was then the owner of the Taimio Tonga, and his deputy editor, and then there was also Akalisi Puhira, who was the leader of the pro-democracy movement. He's now the Prime Minister of Tonga, but he was a pro-democracy member of Parliament, and he leaked a document which hadn't been tabled in Parliament about an impeachment of one of the ministers. And so he leaked that, and the Taimio Tonga published this document. And so all 3 of them were thrown into jail for contempt of Parliament.
I wasn't aware that PMC was set up to do that, although I was very aware that David Robie was heading up and leading a group of other journalists to call for our release.
That struck me as a clear one of power versus the power of media.
That they had to call media to please tell their friends, do not send anymore. In those days, it were faxes that were sent in, because the machine was breaking down. There was so much faxes coming into the Prime Minister's office, protesting our jailing. And so when I heard about it, the feeling was, wow, there are people out there that cared for what happened to us in Tonga.
The regional media organisation basically did nothing, so it's actually quite important that what we were doing on Pacific Media Watch at the time. So that's what actually got us going.
And so when we were jailed, he came to really to our rescue and did an incredible job.
One of the most important roles of the Pacific Media Centre was to give voice to those issues that just get swept under the rug, that get pushed aside or don't get much airtime or showtime as the other bigger issues.
It's a bit of a lighthouse, you know, like that people can look at it and get information from. And as I said, it's vital if you're going to have an industry that's based around the truth and spreading of information.
The Pacific Media Watch is doing something that nobody else is doing, reporting on media freedom issues and different political developments in the Asia-Pacific region, and it's a really important contribution, I think, to the media in that respect.
David, can you tell me now about the Fiji Security Forces torture prisoners in 2013 and won Daniel the Darts Award?
Well, it was a baptism of fire for Daniel. He'd only just started on the Pacific Media Watch project, and this was his first main story. and he was landed right in the middle of it. So we'd picked up on it, you know, from social media. We'd seen the torture images and so on.
There was a video released showing an escaped prisoner in Fiji who was being tortured, and it was released on YouTube and reported on a different or a range of critical blogs. What I did with great guidance from David was to collate information from the different blogs and put that together.
She did some really good coverage of the Fiji elections, and right in the middle of the coverage, of course, some of the Fiji peacemakers were taken captive in the Golan Heights.
The Fijian peacekeepers in Syria have finally been released. In this video on YouTube channel Talan, the men can be seen being welcomed and reaching safety. And at a press conference this morning, Prime Minister Voreqe Bainimarama says the soldiers are heroes. Most amazing benefits of being at the Pacific Media Centre was just the freedom to go wherever we needed to go, to interview whoever we needed to. I mean, we were part of a small newsroom, and to really give voice to those issues that weren't being covered in mainstream media. And I think that's one of the most important roles of the Pacific Media Centre.
The Pacific Islands Forum is a national meeting, and in a certain sense it's the hub of power in the Pacific. In 2011, football team was arriving because the Rugby World Cup followed straight on after. As a student still, I was coordinating in my role a bunch of other students reporting on the forum, and so we went right through the usual channels that a normal media organisation would do, which is to register its journalists, to train them up, and to get out there and report on the stories. We'd have daily meetings to see who would cover what, and we would join the other journalists, you know, side by side, and use the media centre that was set up for the world's journalists to report on the issues. We're at press conferences asking questions just like anyone else. There was a student from Papua New Guinea called Henry Yamo who was in the conference with the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, and asked him a question that sort of was specific to Papua New Guinea. And those sorts of questions were just not being asked by the world's media.
West Papua came up and was very controversial. And one of our students, Henry Yamo, came up with this question, well, what are you doing about human rights in West Papua? And sort of a stunned silence and things. But the extraordinary thing is that Henry got a reply from Ban Ki-moon, which said that, well, he thought that it should go back to the Decolonisation Committee. Exchange with the Secretary General went all around the world. It went viral as a news story. Big news agencies picked up on it and so on as well. Karen Aknatan was a photojournalist, but she was also on the Asia Pacific journalism course that year and part of the coverage of the forum. And she took this wonderful photograph of Ban Ki-moon sort of encountering West Papuan protesters. Some were West Papuans themselves, but many were support people here in Auckland. And they were all waving, and the West Papuan flag, and there was Ban Ki-moon waving back. Wonderful picture.
Now it's time for the Southern Cross. Rightio, so Southern Cross is back. With me in studio is Pacific Media Watch contributing editor Michael Andrew. How are you today?
Very well. How are you?
Very well. Yes, good.
It was just a collaborative interview with the guys at BFM, and then they thought, oh, this is really interesting, and consulted David and said, how about this? This could be good just to get some of the, just to go deeper than you would in a normal interview on the radio about some of the issues in the Pacific. So I'd have a good think every week about one or two topics, and then they'd call up. Most of the time it was over the phone. Once or twice we'd go into the studio. I think these days, more often they just walk across and go into the studio.
Horror in Christchurch this afternoon after shootings at two mosques in the city. Those are Masjid Al-Noor Mosque on Deans Avenue, that is right opposite Hagley Park, and at another mosque in Linwood.
That was sort of like a baptism of fire for Michael. He had just arrived and was just started the job at Pacific Media Watch Project and so on. And next thing, that terrible tragedy happened in Christchurch, and so he was reporting that right through for intensely for the next month or so.
It was obviously very traumatic and very intense and very saddening, but when I got to work, when I started on the Monday, it was obviously everything exclusively dedicated to covering that and just trying to get across it as much as possible. What we do is based around giving a voice to those who don't have a voice in the mainstream media, and that might have been why such misrepresentation was allowed to happen, because a lot of Muslims didn't have a voice in the build-up to the attack.
Things are pretty dire in the Pacific at the moment. Unfortunately, most of our political leaders around the region think very highly of themselves, and they look to the leadership of other politicians in other countries, such as, unfortunately, such as Donald Trump in Washington, and people like President Duterte of the Philippines, and I think the climate that's actually sort of being encouraged by many of these leaders internationally is fear and loathing about journalists and fear and loathing about the media, and simply denigrating the role that the media actually has in democracy. And I think, for example, I was in Paris last year for the Reporters Without Borders Asia Pacific conference, where we were introduced to a video clip of President Zemos of Czechia, the Czech president, who did this appalling thing in Parliament by having a sort of M16 in the, well, actually I think it was the Kalashnikov, but in Parliament there, and it was sort of like labelled for journalists, and essentially he was putting it up an open invitation. There's a bit of a joke, of course, but an open invitation for the assassination of journalists. But it's this sort of attitude that is becoming increasingly marked around the region, and so journalists and the media become scapegoats for the ills of the world. And Pacific political leaders look to this sort of leadership, and they get these ideas. And right now we're facing a lot of problems about laws being imposed by governments in the Pacific, and particularly cyber laws, which ostensibly are to stop cyber crime, but in fact are to gag, essentially will be used to gag the media.
I think we need more places like Pacific Media Watch. The very vision of Pacific Media Watch to be a watchdog to other media outlets is just such a great idea, and I think it's absolutely necessary.
Pacific Media Watch provides an opportunity and a voice for many Pacific media people, many young thinkers, many active, passionate Pacific people who may sometimes be outside the structures or the box and so on, and they get a chance to present their ideas and views. But more so perhaps even than that, it's in a climate of shrinking media freedom, if you like, having something like Pacific Media Watch, even with the limited resources that we have, it does provide a platform and a means to have a free voice and freedom of expression.